The world's latest and greatest AI model is 100% free for you to download and run at home right now. Kimi K2 Thinking is the latest reasoning model from Moonshot AI Labs, which is a Chinese frontier AI lab, and it beats OpenAI's GPT-5, Anthropic's Claude, and Google's Gemini across pretty much all benchmarks. But that's not even the most shocking part. The most shocking part is that it only costs $4.6 million to train and build, which is only a fraction of the billions of dollars spent by OpenAI to train GPT in the first place. It's also 100% open source, which means that you can download and run frontier AI right at home where you're sitting right now. But of course, it begs two very important questions. Number one, is open source AI the winning strategy? We've been led to believe that closed source is typically the better strategy when you run a business, but China and the AI models are proving us wrong here. And the second question, the more ominous question, is will the US stock market bubble finally pop? Josh, what have we got here? What is this new model and why is it taking over social media everywhere I look?
They did it again. The Chinese did it again. They knocked it out of the park. Grand slam, home run. It's an unbelievably impressive model. And this happens every time. We get this amazing flagship model out of the US. A couple months later, we get the same thing, marginally better, at 1/10 of the cost. Like full orders of magnitude cost less than what it costs for the leading AI labs in the US today. The specs are really impressive. We're going to get into everything. We'll start with, I guess, just like the high-level spec sheet. State of the art on Humanities Last Exam, which is the reference point that we kind of use in terms of benchmarks. It scored the highest anyone's ever scored, 44.9%. It has a bunch of these really cool breakthroughs, but the big thing that it excels at, like it says in the post here, reasoning, agentic search, and coding. Now, there's a few cool things that we could talk about here. Ijaz, maybe we'll just get into the charts because I feel like that's an easy way to visualize how much better this model really is than all of the others. And what we're seeing on this chart is that, well, GPT-5 was the best. Kimi K2 is now the new best. And this is as it relates to thinking and reasoning. And this, again, this is so impressive because one, this model is fully open source. You can go download the model and run it yourself locally for free. What were your first thoughts when you saw this? Because to me, I was like, oh my God, why would I use anything else?
My first thought, if I'm being honest, Josh, was like to look at the stock market. I was like, is this going to crash the entire US stock market? Like when DeepSeek initially released the R1 thinking model, do you remember? It was at the end of last year. People's kind of entire bubble and vision of how AI models were trained was completely burst. And since then, China has repeatedly delivered on breaking edge models, one of which is the Moonshot AI Lab team, which built Kimi K2. It's such an impressive model for a few different reasons for me. Number one, it can now compete with all the best. And personally, GPT-5 is something that I use pretty much every day, whether it's for like kind of casual prompts and requests, or whether it's kind of like for deeper thinking and research and some of the lines of work that I do. So it's become kind of like quintessential for me. Now, to have a separate model that I can download and run privately on my own computer at home, that I'm showing on this tweet here, that costs 60 cents per million token input and $2.5 output, is just an insane cost-cutting average where if I was running a business using an AI model, there's like very little reason for me not to switch over to something like this, aside from maybe like maintenance and setup and stuff like that. The other really impressive thing for me, Josh, was the team itself. Like, this is only a 2-year-old startup, which reminds me of another 2-year-old startup, which is Elon Musk's xAI, right? And there's a funny link between these two models, Josh, which is Kimi K2's reasoning, this thinking model, can do so because it does this like really neat little chain of thought experiment where it takes many steps to kind of think to a logical answer versus just kind of like splurging an answer for you. That's something that Grok Heavy 4 did when that they pioneered when they launched their new product. So Kimi K2 is kind of like drawn on some of these learnings from xAI to produce a similar model. The other really cool thing is it does this thing called tool use or tool calling whilst it's thinking. So if you imagine, as I'm kind of like trying to think through a complex problem, I will leverage different tools to be able to help me get to the answer. So if I'm doing a maths exam, I can use a calculator. Or if I'm doing a deep research question, I might use Google. This AI model naturally does that and has access to over 200 to 300 different tool calls and tool uses whilst it does its thinking. So just overall a very impressively new looking AI model.
Yeah, Ijaz, you mentioned the cost being 60 cents per million tokens. And
Yes.
I just want to add a little bit of context as to how low that actually is. I was looking at the GPT-5 Pro cost per inputs, and it is $15 per million tokens. 15 for the GPT-5 Pro cost currently. The output is $120 per million tokens. Granted, this is the top of the top. If you're using GPT-5 standard, input is $1.25 per million tokens, output is $10. So any way you scrape it, it's at least a 2x cost reduction, up to like 100x on the highest end, assuming it can compete with GPT-5 Pro, which all of those benchmarks suggest it very well can. So the cost is really like, it's a big deal. And to dig more into the point that you were making, Ijaz, and how it actually works, well, we can get to this one first.
Sorry. No. Sorry.
We'll get there. Save the memes. Don't spoil the memes
sorry,
yet. We got to get to the funny jokes next. But basically, the way this works is like there's this very complicated diagram on the screen. I'm not going to try to even explain what that is. But there's this fun way that I like to describe it when I was describing it to my friend earlier this morning, which is that like Kimi K2, it's like this giant school, and it has these things called specialists. And in fact, Kimi K2 has 384 specialists. You could think of these specialists as like a math club or a history club, coding club, debate, whatever it is. And when you ask it a question, it doesn't invite the whole school. It doesn't invite all the clubs. It's just, Ijaz, if you ask for a math question, it will query the math club. And it chooses 8 out of those 384 clubs to help combine their answers, pick the experts, and decide how it's going to solve this problem. So it has 1 trillion parameters, but it only uses 32 billion of them at once. And that's how we're able to get the huge cost reduction, because it uses this thing called mixture of experts. A lot of people describe it as MOE, but basically what it is instead of using the entire model's intelligence to answer, what should I have for breakfast this morning? It will take the chef club, it will take the health club, it will combine those together, and it will form an answer that should hopefully give you just as good as a result if you took the entire model, but it's much more efficient in terms of cost, in terms of energy, and in terms of the amount of tokens it could generate because it's so much cheaper across the board. And I think that's one of the big, really exciting things that has been cool to see coming out of China. We saw it with DeepSeek, we see it with Kimi, and it's this mixture of agents architecture where they're really kind of modularizing the entire model and only using the stuff that's important for the specific query.
They were put in a very constrained position, which is they didn't have access to the latest GPUs or NVIDIA GPUs. There's been a bunch of US tariff restrictions on Chinese labs getting access to these kinds of things. So they've really needed to kind of like work within their bounds and means. And so coming up with an architecture like mixture of experts, or the one that they did, is super important. And it brings me to this meme, Josh, which is, what are we doing here? There is an obvious mismatch between American-made AI models and the Chinese ones. You've got OpenAI, which is now projected to spend $1.4 trillion over the next 5 years. That's trillion with a T, versus Kimi training for $4.6 million. Now, I know there's a bit of like clickbaitiness here. That $4.6 million was relative to one training run, and usually it takes a few training runs. But let's say it took like 20 training runs, right? At $4.6 million, that's still only like 100 mil, right? Or less than that. So it doesn't really matter when you put it into the context that GPT-5 is rumored to have cost $1.7 to $2.4 billion for OpenAI to train. So there's a mismatch that I don't quite understand, Josh. And that's what makes me the most nervous when it comes to what American-made companies and frontier labs are doing. I feel like they're missing the mark. I don't quite know what it is, whether it's this mixture of experts thing, but there's someone's being sold a lie, and I don't know whether it's me or whether it's me like looking at this Kimi K2 model and being like, wow, it's so amazing.
Yeah, when I think about the role that China plays versus the United States in terms of like open source companies or closed source companies here in the US, the thing that is reassuring to me, at least, is a lot of these innovative breakthroughs that happen on the software level actually do happen in these private AI labs. We do get like chain of thought and reasoning, and there's like this whole slew of new innovation that becomes standard very quickly. That all happens in the United States AI labs. And as far as we're concerned, the AI labs in the US still they're making the most progress the fastest. They are creating the most innovation. And then what you kind of see, like we described earlier in the episode, is that innovation starts to trickle down, whether it's voluntary or whether it's stolen, and it gets implemented into these new models. And they just completely cut out the bottom in terms of cost and efficiency, because that's kind of all they're able to do. They don't have access to the resources of like millions of GPUs from Jensen Huang. And NVIDIA, they don't have the access to $50 billion of CapEx just to spend on employees, just to spend on salaries and compensation. So it seems to me like, I mean, we're still doing very well. It's just China is very good at implementing the technology and applying it at scale in a way that's open sourced. And the open source thing, there's a lot to say for that because it's very impressive, and it's kind of this community effort that we saw early days with the United States. But once they became better, they closed it off. So what happens is you get innovation in one company like Kimi, and then you see it implemented in DeepSeek, and then you see it implemented in Qwen. And then suddenly this technology is kind of synchronously growing between the three because it's all open source. They're publishing all the code, all the open weights, and it's much more easier for them to thrive. Whereas innovation in the United States very much happens behind a closed wall, and it's only leaked out at the advent of a new model when they release it to the world and people kind of reverse engineer how it works.
I was reading an article in the Financial Times where they interviewed Jensen Huang, and he said verbatim that China will win the AI race if they continue down the path that they're currently on, and if the US doesn't kind of ramp up their energy production. And he was making a wider point that their open source strategy is pretty effective in the way that they're building these new AI models with the constraints that you just mentioned. Kind of speaking more about the open sourceness and the benefits of this, I've got a tweet up here which shows that Kimi K2 Thinking, this new model, can basically run on 2 MacBook M3 Ultras, which is like a couple of $1,000s worth of cost, which is an insane thing to do, to run frontier AI model at home privately in your house, trained and fine-tuned on any of your own private data. So you don't need to kind of like sell that data to Sam Altman or whoever. Just super cool and super cheap, right? Because you're running local inference at home. So you don't have to worry about anyone kind of like spying on any of your queries or your prompts or your research. It's just all at home, which I thought was super cool. The other part of the open sourceness, which I found interesting, Josh, was the fact that they had an MIT license with this new release, or an adjusted MIT license. And we'll dig into that in a second. But the point being, when DeepSeek released their first major open source model and it took the world by storm, there wasn't any major licenses around that. So you could pretty much download and do whatever the hell you wanted to it for it. You could implement it into your own product, whether you were an American founder. And if, let's say you scale that up to 1 million users that used a feature that was leveraging that DeepSeek model, you wouldn't have to credit that team at all. Kimi K2 kind of like takes a step in a different direction here, where they've released an MIT license where I think if you hit, I think it's either 10 million or 20 million users for your product, you need to show the Kimi K2 label and say that, listen, I'm using this model under the hood. But there's some differences with this license, right, Josh? Can we dig into that?
I believe it's modified. I don't know to the extent that it is modified, but I know that there is something different going on here. What does it say? Our only modification part is that if the software or any derivative works thereof is used for any of your commercial products or services that have more than 100 million monthly active users, or more than $20 million or equivalent in other currencies in monthly revenue, you shall prominently display Kimi K2 on the user interface of such product or service. That's a fun little marketing ploy.
Fair enough. You know what it reminds me of, Josh?
What's that?
It's what Meta tried to do with their Llama models, right? So Meta is the only other major American company that I can think of that went down this open source AI route. And the goal, or the intended goal at the time, was to basically level the playing field between Meta and OpenAI and other frontier model AI labs, which had raced so far ahead. So if you released all this cutting edge AI tech for free and accessible to anyone, then it kind of drives down the cost premium that OpenAI and all these other frontier AI labs can charge you to access this thing. China's doing that as a vast hole on the American AI stock market, right? So that's why we saw like NVIDIA crash, I think 4.2% on the news getting released and such. I'm curious whether this kind of pops the bubble and the CapEx bubble in America, Josh. Is that a crazy thing to say? I mean, the markets reacted pretty viscerally to this news.
I don't think I have a problem with this. I don't think it's popping a bubble. I don't think we're in trouble. I think this is just totally fine so long as we continue to stay slightly ahead or at least at par. I think we're really excellent at making software, distributing software, creating products. I think China's really good at shamelessly innovating and deploying without needing to go through all of the hoops and intellectual problems that the United States mostly has. So I don't think this will lead to any sort of bubble popping. I think a lot of the frontier innovative stuff still happens in the US. The place where I will begin to start to get a little worried is when this switches to embodied AI. Once we start moving from large language models to implementing these into robots or implementing these into physical hardware, that's where I think we have problems. On the software front, we're good. We're crushing it. Everyone's spending tons of money. On the hardware front, we don't have the same lead. And over the last, 30 to 50 years, we've kind of outsourced our manufacturing capabilities to other places, and therefore are just kind of, everyone knows we just can't really make things cost effectively here in the United States. If we are at a foot race with China when it comes to making embodied AI, like humanoid robots, specialized robots, whatever it may be, that's where things start to get a little bit scary, because that's where there is a significant lead, and that lead comes in the form of atoms, which are much more difficult to move than bits, because you can steal some open source code, create this slight innovation on top, roll it out to 1 billion users overnight, and that's innovation. That does not happen between version 2 and version 3 of your humanoid robot. You actually have to build it with a factory, with real materials and people and places, and it's very difficult and challenging to do. And China very much stands to be the largest winner in that. So I think on the software front, I feel really confident. And as of now, that's all that we're battling on. But in this near future, where things start to become embodied, where AI becomes physically manifested in the world around us, that seems like a place where I would start looking at Chinese investments a little bit more than the American ones.
Okay, I think I might push back a little bit and say that there is reasonable evidence to be bearish on the software side before it gets to embodied AI. So a few ways to think about it. There is such a gross discrepancy when it comes to capital expenditure for these things. On one side, you've got the US spending trillions of dollars literally to train AGI or the best AI models. And on this side, you're in like the hundreds of millions of dollars, which is like an order of magnitude less, right? So there's an obvious mismatch here that we aren't seeing, whether it comes down to training architecture, training design, or just kind of like hardware manufacturing. I don't know where that kind of advantage is being played, but the Chinese have found it, and they're able to kind of really push down on that lever to get ahead or on par with the US. And they've been able to successfully do this for years now at this point. DeepSeek was kind of like test case 1. Now we've seen like, at least 50 open source models come out of Chinese frontier AI labs since then. Number 2, it's not like the US government has kind of like not tried to constrain them. We've imposed a number of different sanctions, which include, constraining which GPUs NVIDIA and other manufacturers within the US can sell to China, but that still hasn't stopped them. They've been able to maintain and train these frontier AI intelligences despite all of these different things. So I think if I were to look on the other side of this, it would be, so what if you have an open source model that is super cool? Why aren't you using it right now? Like, I'm not using Kimi K2 regularly, even though I use GPT-5 and it might be better than GPT-5. And the answer for me is pretty simple. I'm locked into an ecosystem in OpenAI that I'm pretty happy with, which is it has memory on me. It understands who I am. It has a context of all the previous chats that I have with it. But also, most importantly, Josh, if there's an issue with something on my account or something that I'm trying to use, there's a community that I can access. There's a support team that I can speak to. There's a software ecosystem that supports me, right? Versus me jumping ship to kind of Kimi K2, setting it up on my own, and then having to like troubleshoot it myself. I think a lot of people will be disincentivized to do that.
It is difficult, but we're seeing market forces from both sides, right? Like I saw you included a link here somewhere where Cursor and Windsurf's new AI models, they were using some sort of Chinese models. In fact, they were thinking in Chinese. And I found this really fascinating that like American-made products are now thinking in the Chinese language. So that's certainly a concern in terms of the commercial side, where those API costs really matter, where if you can get 1 million tokens for 60 cents versus $10, that really affects the margins of your business. For consumers like us, there's no real interest to use Kimi K2. And the phenomenon you spoke about earlier, where you can actually run a quantized version of Kimi K2 on 2 Mac Studios running the M3 Ultra chips, it generates tokens at like 13 to 15 tokens per second. So it's very slow. Slow. That you're getting like a sentence or 2 every second. Which it's much slower. It's going to feel groggy. It's not going to feel well. There's a case to be made that changes, because this year And it's funny that Apple's really the only computer that supports this now. They're releasing the M5 Ultra, which will be the new version. And it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. What I found interesting, this one side note, actually, that I wanted to share with you, Ejaz, because you might find it cool too, is the version that runs on these Apple computers, the Apple Studios. It's a slightly quantized version. And I heard about this and I learned about this recently in the Tesla earnings call that they had, the shareholder meeting recently. And we're going to have an episode on this later this week. But there's this interesting thing that Elon mentioned during the episode where he was talking about quantized versus floating point AI. And I was like, what the hell is that? Like, why are you spending so much time talking about this? It doesn't make sense. And what I realized is a lot of AI models, they use like many, many points after the decimal in terms of data to get more precise results. And that is floating point. When you quantize a model, you remove all of the data to the right of the model and you just go to single integers. So you lose the variance of maybe up to like 60%, but you gain so much faster efficiency, so much better speed improvements, cost improvements, and you can actually run it locally on these things. So I think it's interesting to see the different decisions that people are making in terms of, well, how precise does the model have to be versus how cost effective and how efficient does it need to be? And what we're seeing with Kimi K2 is it's very easy to over-index on the efficiency, but maybe that's not the stated goal of OpenAI, where if they really wanted to, they could quantize these models. They could go more to integer like type compute. And it was just something I was thinking about is how they approach them. Because it could just be, well, Kimi's just kind of optimizing for speed and efficiency. And the downstream effect is it's also really fast. Whereas OpenAI kind of hasn't really optimized for that specifically yet.
Right. And the counter argument to that point would be, well, Josh, it's crushing all the benchmarks that we've evaluated all the other American models on, right?
Yeah.
So surely it's much better. And my pushback on that would be like, well, benchmarks don't really materialize in real life use. So what if it crushes 50% on humanities last exam? Is it useful for me to use? Does it understand what I'm trying to say? Does it understand the context of the prompts that I'm putting into it? The other side of this, on the point of quantization, Josh, is I think that a lot of frontier American AI labs like OpenAI, Google, etc., actually have enough compute to give you the best experience, the highest floating point experience, to put it into that context. But they're using the majority of that compute to train the next big model that we haven't even seen yet, right? There was news that broke last week that OpenAI is doing this, right? So technically they have enough compute to give you like amazing service all year round, but they're using 70% of that compute to train GPT-6. So I think it's just a matter of prioritization right now until we reach some kind of parity that these AI models are good enough. But I will say, from all of the things that we've discussed on this episode so far, there is one clear winner, and that is the consumer. It's you, I, and everyone listening to the show, which basically gets access to frontier level intelligence for the cost of next to nothing. Download it completely free and run it privately at home. On this tweet that I have pulled up here, it basically says for every closed model, there's an open source alternative in it. And it goes through a list like Sonnet 4.5, you've got GLM 4.6, Grok Code Fast, you've got GPT OSS, GPT-5, you've got Kimi K2 Thinking. And it just goes on and on and on. And if we look at this kind of like a year and a half ago, maybe even 2 years ago, this list would be non-existent. It would just be Frontier AI Labs on the closed source side and zero open source side. So to see this kind of progress is really, really encouraging.
Yeah, it's going to be a race. It's going to be a battle between open and closed source. And perhaps that's not even the battle. Perhaps it's open source until they catch up to closed source. And then it's closed source across the board. So it's going to be interesting to see the developments. We have a new batch of models that are coming. We're kind of in this weird limbo where Gemini 3 is hopefully coming soon. We'll have some new benchmarks. And one of the things that was this harsh truth to kind of wrap my head around, which is what you just mentioned, Ejaz, and the fact that everyone's just compute constrained. Like OpenAI could have made GPT-5 probably twice as impressive if they really wanted to. They just have no compute to serve that. And it would have been way too expensive and way too slow. So it's not that it can't be done. It's just that people don't have the resources to do it. So it's this constant balancing act. And it's going to be fun to see how companies kind of slot themselves into that curve of like how much they want to spend on compute versus cost versus just what they have available to actually use to train these models and deploy them at scale to users.
And that's it for today, folks. Super fun episode. It is always surprising to me how quickly open source catches up with closed source centralized AI. I always think kind of like it's going to lag a few years, and now it's come down to the fact that it's lagging a few weeks. We have a jam-packed week. We have potentially a new nano banana model being released by Google tomorrow.
Fingers crossed. I'm praying for that.
Fingers crossed. I'm also praying for that as well. And we have a second episode based on Tesla's Investor Day, which had some really jam-packed, exciting news. Now, listen, if you want the US to win this AI race, and make no mistake, it is a race, you need to subscribe to American AI YouTube channels, one of which is us. Please subscribe, hit the notification buttons, wherever you're listening to, give us a rating. We are helped by these so much. It is bringing up so much awareness. The algorithm is favoring us. We're getting all these wonderful views and new incomers. We've got 1,000 of you from last week, which is just insane. Hello, welcome to the channel. We hope you enjoy the content, and we will see you on the next one.
Yeah, before I let them off the hook, I'm checking, I'm doing the stat update. 83% of the people that watched last week were not subscribed. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe.
Guys.
Or go on Spotify, my preferred place of finding this podcast. It's the best. Okay. I'm telling you, I don't know how to describe this to people any better. Spotify is so good. You have the video, you have the audio. You could turn it off and lock your phone without needing a premium membership. Please go over there. Go leave a comment over there, because also the comment section is kind of popping too. So anyway, thank you for all the support.
We do not pick and choose. Wherever you listen, go for it.
There you go. All right. We will see you guys in the next one. Thank you for watching as always. Much appreciated. Peace.